Hello again, and glad to have your ears tuned to Radio Rowe. I'm Matthew Stillman, a regular but not the only host of Radio Rowe. And today I'm here with Kelly Butler, who is going to be doing a workshop at Rowe really soon about the art of shrouding. Kelly, before we introduce you, which will come in the process of us talking, where I'd like to start off with is some bibliomancy. And so I've got in my hand a book called Home Ground by Barry Lopez. Home Ground, a language for a North American landscape. And if you could pick a number between 1 and 398.
57.
57. It's the number on the back of a Heinz bottle,
Mhm.
the number of departments there are in appellations in France for wine.
Oh, see, very auspicious.
Very auspicious. And the reason why we're doing this is because there's just these short definitions of things that you find in the world, and just sort of wondering, I'm going to read you one of these definitions and see if it has any recollections for you about place and don't try to make it connect to the subject, although it might.
Okay.
So, um, the word that's on page 57 that's most obvious is the word butte. And it says, a butte is a mesa's orphan, the freestanding remnant of a larger landform, protected from the erosional brunt of rain, frost, and wind by its overlay of hard caprock. The butte's mass stands flat-top and steep-sided, always taller than it is wide. The parent escarpment may be but a gap of space away. Imagine this gap filled with rock, and you can picture the entire landform's sweeping, high-crowned continuity. Or the parent escarpment may be entirely eroded, leaving the outlier butte to evoke a terrestrial loneliness, a marker to help you find your way home in the desert, a gaunt cipher to align with summer stars. In The Man Who Killed the Deer, Frank Waters' classic novel, he writes, the moon has risen high above the great still tree. He could see between them, on one side, a jaundiced vista of the desert sloping up and away, past a far, flat-top butte, to the long line of mountains lying like the upturned edge of the horizon. And that particular one was written by Ellen Malloy. So, when you hear butte and that description, where does that take you? You've had a tremendous long history with death care, but not only that, and scholarship in lots of ways. But just tell us about what butte and this little definition, where it takes you, if you'd be so kind.
Well, the first thing that sprang to mind was the little bit of time that I spent in Butte, Montana, a very beautiful place, and on one of the many cross-country road trips that I've done some years ago, but I think of those times very fondly. But I also, as you were reading, this idea of orphan and the gap between this this outcropping of rock and its parent. And that, of course, reminded me of the way that we've been separated from some of our traditional knowing, some of our traditional practices, not only around death care, but including death care. So I was imagining us sort of isolated and lonely and missing what we once belonged to, and imagining the potential to be reunited.
Yeah, and of course, in a butte case, it'll be a very long time.
Mhm.
But maybe buttes have a memory of once they were once together. So thank you for that recollection and and reference. Um, so you have this online workshop coming up at Rowe on November 7th, 14th, and 21st, uh, 7 o'clock in the evening. And it's called the Art of Shrouding. And of course, shroud is a mystical, sort of spooky sounding word. Um, and without going into exactly what the course is, we don't want to talk about the course, and it's 3 weeks long, and so there's lots to say. I guess it evokes, like, why would one wonder about shrouding at all versus just regular burial?
Mm, That's a great question. Uh, I would say this operates on two different levels. there's both the practical aspect, the practical skill of shrouding, and it's something that we can learn how to do. It was once probably fairly widely understood as a practice. But there's also the imaginative, creative piece that I'm hoping this will spark, that it will help people consider, remind them that we can meet dying and death differently than what we've done in recent decades. So it's definitely something that I hope people will put into practice, into use, but it might just act as a reflective practice, a contemplation of the fact that, one day we all will die, and that considering these things, it might seem difficult to do, but in fact, engaging with these thoughts and tending to our grief is a way of building resiliency and of helping us bear life's challenges.
Again, just going back to like the evocation of the word, if anyone even thinks about a shroud at all, it seems like living people don't wear shrouds, although maybe you're shrouded in mystery. But of course, there's the famous Shroud of Turin. So, without sort of making too much of a case for shrouding, but you said, in the past couple of decades, um, that sort of evokes in me like sort of a question or a wondering of, is shrouding making a comeback, or what have been people thinking about the last couple of decades to try to approach dying differently? Maybe a little bit of a sense of the runway of how did we, whoever the we is, get here to start to even want to or need to think about burying differently?
Well, it's more than a couple decades. If I said that, then I misspoke. It's the past few decades, the last century really, that we've become disconnected from death care. And you're right, shroud is a word that we often use, to say that, the trees are shrouded in fog, or that a subject matter is shrouded in mystery. And the word itself, shroud, simply means to cover, a covering. So it is both a noun and a verb. And it is not a practice that has been lost in every tradition. It's still part of Jewish burial and Muslim burial practices. But broadly in Western culture and elsewhere, this has been forgotten. And again, I'd say that started probably, let's just say 100 years ago or so. Death care practices started to change around the time of the Civil War, when we had soldiers who were dying very far from home, and embalming was introduced as a way to preserve the body and return that soldier to his family. And we were mostly talking about men.
Yeah.
And so from that moment on, something that didn't require any particularly professional skills, I'll say, started to become something that only a few people knew how to do. And so rather than the community tending to the dead, it started to be that a funeral industry emerged, and we moved death out of the home and into the funeral home. Funeral homes are named such, or funeral parlor, to echo the fact that it used to be we would lay out our beloved dead in the front parlor, and our neighbors and family would come to visit and spend time. And we didn't necessarily shroud. Sometimes a person would go into a casket and be buried that way. A shroud is just one potential option. The thing that I appreciate about shrouding, and the reason I want to share it with others, is because you probably in this very moment have everything that you need in your linen closet to take care of a dead body, to take care of someone who's died. And it doesn't require any fancy equipment, any esoteric kind of skill or knowing. And it's not that, I think most people still may not choose this, but I would like for them to know that it's an option. And I, having worked both in hospice and in funeral homes, I often encounter families that haven't considered these things and then find themselves in a moment of crisis, and they're deciding the way the decisions are being made is as a reaction that rather than a thoughtful response. And then down the road, oftentimes there's regret that it was an emergency. There wasn't really time to reflect on what the family might need or what the person would want. So, so again, this is a way of considering that, this is something that will happen to all of us eventually. It can be a last loving act that we offer to our beloved family members, and it is frankly a pretty straightforward thing. If you've ever cared for a baby, you could shroud a body.
Right. And so there's this deep connection. Of course, I'd say that most people don't realize or know because it just is so um, quote unquote natural. This is just the way we bury people, but that it emerges from the war industry.
Mhm.
And with complete, no malice or mustache twirling of like, we're going to create an industry. Like, there was a sense of, well, we need to deal with these piles of bodies. Uh, where are we going to put them? Well, we can't put them all here. We got to send them somewhere. We got to make them um, last a little while. Then you create an industry. So like the unseen consequences of trying to make things better creates an industry that cuts us off from this lineage,
Mhm.
which is not some pure unbroken lineage, but there is one.
Mhm. I would say too that what happens at the time of the Civil War, that we have also perhaps dropped this thread, is that at that time there would have been an understanding that people needed to engage with their dead.
Hmm.
The dead, we owe something to the dead, and um, returning them to their families would have seemed important, because I suspect it was, if not overtly understood, there was some innate understanding that by engaging with the dead, by being present to this loss, it was a way of uh, metabolizing, a way of um, making sense of what's happened, and of letting our emotional, psychic selves catch up to the fact that this is the new reality, that this person has died. So it's a challenging thing, but it is better for um, the way we carry that loss forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's, of course, in the last, let's say, 15 years or so, since you mentioned decades before, maybe in the last 15 years, there's been an upswelling of conversations that are called, death cafes and things like that, where it's just um, people getting together and talking about the implications of death, and sometimes that's philosophizing, maybe sometimes that's crying, maybe sometimes that's reading books or poetry together. It could sound like all kinds of things. What's the difference, as you understand it, between a death cafe, I mean, of course, they're all different, so we have to use generalizing terms here, and something that's a bit more focused, that's really, I mean, in this case, about shrouding and in terms of what it's trying to be in the presence of.
Mhm. I would say that they're different entry points, aiming towards the same goal. I think people are starting to realize that, again, our decades of denying death, of avoiding death, of trying to outsource it and kind of hide it away, hasn't really helped. We have untended grief that makes it difficult to face losses and challenges as they emerge. And so there's a movement afoot that is trying to do things differently, and frankly, trying to do things in an old way. Uh, I think that, death cafes, workshops, they're all different ways of engaging with what's true for all of us. And, talking about our grief, having it witnessed is very helpful. Attending a vigil, some kind of ritual that allows us to go into our grief and express it, also wonderful. Some of us are very practical in nature. Certainly I am. And so I like the adding a tool to the tool chest. This is a way that we can literally tend to the dead, and it's something that is an option. We can talk more about whether or not a particular state or cemetery would allow a burial in shroud, but it is a way of being physically present to what's happened, and it's part of a preparation for burial that makes for, again, perhaps it can be challenging, but it really helps us come to terms with this is the reality, and it helps our grief to be engaged and to begin the process of healing.
Yeah. Thank you again for that. This is all tender stuff.
Mhm.
Um, so often when people are getting close to dying and people know that that's happening, or they don't and they're surprised by it, of course, it happens in lots of different ways. Some of the responses are that, quilts get knitted, soup gets made, hands are employed, and there's certainly the phrase, many hands, light work, shows up in lots of different ways, but sometimes around like these overwhelming times, the sense of like, we just need all hands on deck. But this is a really specific way of employing the hands in a way. And you said before that anyone who's, wrapped a baby, you can shroud. And so that connects birth and death. But if you'd say a little bit of, as your understanding, since you've been around hospice from, look, you work with AIDS patients a long time ago when, AIDS was a new thing. People were trying to figure out what is this plague upon us, and worked in hospital and in funeral industries. What's your understanding of what using our hands have to do with maybe not fully metabolizing, but moving our relationship to grief and endings?
Hmm. That's a beautiful question. I think that there's something that reminds us of our humanness when we employ our hands. It takes us into the experience in a way that, we're fully immersed, we're a participant, we are engaged in this act, versus, sort of an observer who's detached and from afar witnessing what's happening. And it doesn't, we tend, it doesn't go in the same way. We don't take that in as a reality when we have this sort of detached observer role. But when you're laying your hands on, whether it's, a new baby, or again, your beloved parent, sibling, partner who's died, you cannot escape the reality of that moment, and whether the great joy of it or the deep sorrow. And this is some of what, we teach in community death care, that ignoring or denying those experiences and those emotions don't make them go away. They're just left unmetabolized, and add to the burden of the loss. We end up with things like complicated grief, disenfranchised grief, and it becomes more challenging when future losses emerge. And I hear from folks that feel like they didn't properly deal with a parent's death. They just went back to work and moved on, and 9 months later they're in the grocery store aisle weeping because their favorite brand of soup isn't on the shelf. And so really small things can end up being very disruptive, because again, grief that's ignored doesn't go away. It just waits. So to put our hands to this is a way of really acknowledging what's happened. And it can be provocative, it can be very challenging, but what we're doing is we're working through that emotion, of and the experience of loss. And again, this isn't the only way of doing it, but it's one piece that you might want to become familiar with. And the other thing that I think is really helpful is that it's a bit like practicing for any other activity you might take on, whether that's practicing your layup for basketball or, you know,
These are exactly the same, of course.
yeah, but it really is that there's, if you have the embodied experience of, oh, I've been here before, I've done this before, I know what to do, that actually helps support us when we're in the actual moment of a loss. And it's it's much less confronting when we're doing it as an imagined exercise, again, as a reflective or contemplative practice. It allows us to contend with some of these difficult subject matters in a way that there's greater access, than when you are actually in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of a loss.
Yeah, so this of course connects before when you said it, if you've ever changed a baby, you can do this. Most, I'd say broadly, when babies arrive, there's a sense of joy, and deaths, of course you said that sometimes the death can be a relief if someone has been suffering and enduring something really hard and everyone else around them has been too. So maybe it's sorrow, but without saying the whole thing, there's the famous Khalil Gibran poem that says, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and that self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes full with your tears. And how else can it be?" So this can sound very heavy-hearted, but maybe you'd say a little bit of your understanding about that, while this is grief work, about what your experience in community death care of how it relates to joy and loving life, without necessarily thinking that it's fun um, to wrap the and the best experience you've ever had. And I'd come back, I give it 5 stars. Um, what's your how have you seen joy play out in community death care spaces? Could you started uh, community death care Ottawa, so you've been around this and helping people um, in that part of Ontario and other parts of Ontario um, be in the presence of these things.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I'd start by saying, and if you'll allow me to be philosophical for a moment,
Well, I think
I,
we'll find a way.
I think
Hey, Frank, could you turn up the philosophical knob? Perfect.
ready for
Okay,
it?
we can now get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Community death care and death care practices, in my mind, are human making. It's culture work. And again, because we've been disconnected from it for so long, like that, the Butte Formation from its parent, orphaned, as it were, I think many of us have forgotten that. We have forgotten the gifts that exist in that space, the potential that's there. And that might seem like a strange thing, how can this be human making or culture work? But if we deny half of our experience, half of our emotions, we're not fully ourselves. We're not fully engaged in life. And so, this beautiful poem that you just quoted, the being present to sorrow actually deepens our joy because it's increasing our capacity.
Mm.
And, I've often said, and anybody who's part of community death care knows this, the secret that outsiders aren't aware of is that, we're a fun bunch. We're a very joyful bunch, because to be in the presence of dying and death makes it so clear how precious life is. And so we relish those moments of joy. We relish the celebrations that mark our days, and not just the losses and sorrows, but it is by contending with the losses and sorrows that we allow for that deepening into all that life has to offer.
Yeah. And it's not like it finds a depth. It sounds a little bit what you're saying is that it makes one.
Mhm.
Because it's not that it's all automatically there just to be discovered.
No, no, I would say that that's part of the reflective practice. We can go through this and be unaffected. We can go through this mindlessly and, sort of on automatic. And sometimes that happens because we don't have the skills, because we don't have, any kind of map for how to navigate. And this too is a little bit of what we're trying to do with any of the things that you mentioned, the death cafes or grief vigils, all these different ways of trying to approach this very challenging part of the human experience. Um, yeah.
That's it's a tremendous thing. I mean, in this 3 week course, while we can't say exactly what's going to happen, it'll be sort of an introduction. This isn't a certification for anything. Like you don't become anything with this. You just start to be in the presence of starting to ask the questions that a shroud you might start to scratch your head with. And I think that's probably an important thing to say because there certainly are no lack of death doulas, whatever that might mean, who are looking to sort of increase their skills. But this is less a skills contention, it sounds like, and more like a question asking, but not from a perspective of I have these 10 questions about shrouds.
Well, I would actually say it's both. It's the both and
Hmm.
that there is absolutely the practical aspect of we are going to teach you how to shroud a body, what you need. We'll direct you towards shroud making if that's something that's of interest. But we're also engaging in the reflective practice. How might making your own shroud become a contemplation of mortality? How might engaging in this act bring you to the reality of life's finitude? And so this is something that might appeal to different groups, that whether it's something that you actually want to have the skill to offer your community, or you're trying to reclaim something that your people once would have done for each other,
Yeah.
or whether this is a contemplative act for you, that it's a something that you want to know about, so that you can just reflect on what this might be. So there's definitely sort of the both and there is the second evening of the class will be a hands-on demonstration, and we'll be inviting people to practice that in the week after, and then come back to talk about what the experience was like.
Yeah. Well, if you're listening to this or you've read the the write up of this on the Rowe website and decide to listen or watch this, what sort of things um, be ticking in someone that might make them a good candidate to think like, oh yeah, this is kind of maybe a direction I should be pointed in or walking around with you, or maybe in general, but certainly with you. So, what are some signs or signals that people might want to keep an ear for?
Mhm. Um, well, that's a big answer for me, because I
I
think
know.
everyone would enjoy or benefit from this in some fashion. Perhaps death terrifies you. Come. And, in this really I don't like to say safe space, but maybe brave space.
Hmm.
Nothing bad is happening. We're just talking about it. Come. If you want to reclaim a tradition that, again, was once, part of your inheritance from your people. So from a historical way, from a wanting to connect to culture way, you might want to join us. Perhaps you're involved in community death care or trying to offer that to your community. Uh, and learn how this is done and the different ways it can be done. There's not just one method of shrouding. And if you're just trying to be more present to your own mortality, if you're trying to deepen into a contemplative practice, this is also a great way to contend with some of these ideas. And many spiritual traditions teach that thinking about our death every day is an important part of being human. And lastly, I do hope that it's a creative wondering for people. We'll look at the way that shrouding shows up in art, in song, in poetry, in paintings. And so this might be a bit of a reminder that shrouds are a little more omnipresent than we might realize.
Right. So, you've mentioned lineage. You also mentioned thread. You also mentioned about weave in. Um, and of course, a thread is spun. But of course, you know, rem I'd be leaving a big gap here if you didn't say at the beginning what you have in your own linen closet and the word lineage, which is right in the presence of all of what you've been talking about. The word lineage comes from the word linen, from the
Mhm,
line of thread that would have been spun.
mhm,
So, would that sort of like make that like the button hook that closes it all off? What's your like, spin with that a little bit about the connection between the hands, which I was bringing up before,
mhm,
spinning, making, lineage, linen, um, weaving in what gets woven or who.
mhm. You're beautifully some of how this to me is culture work. There is such a weaving together. There's a strengthening of bonds between people, this community building aspect. It is a way of being together, of creating community, of tending the broken threads. And the work of the hand, inevitably we are present to what's happening. And it brings it close. It makes it impossible to deny. And it also can bring a sense of, dare I say, satisfaction. I mean, we can know how our loved one was tended. We can know the good
Mm,
work that we've done because it was by our own hand. And
yeah,
so there's a knowingness that comes with it. There's a direct experience that I think can help bring us towards meaning, can help with the sense making at a time when everything seems quite senseless.
yeah,
It's if we and this again is the beauty of this kind of workshop. We can enter into this in a moment that is, calm, have a nice cup of tea, be sitting in our comfortable chair, and we aren't responding to a crisis. We're not responding to a death. We're just entering into this imagined potential. And it prepares us though for when those moments arrive. There's a knowledge that we've gained, a skill that we have perhaps developed. and we'll know what to do. And I think, I mean, a heartbreaking but powerful reminder is, the news in recent days and weeks of the terrible hurricanes and the devastation that has been the result of these storms. And we look, we celebrate, we hold up the people that just know what to do in those moments. And so this is kind of a way of sorts of building that muscle, that when the moment of crisis arrives, you'll know what to do. And it does help. It helps shepherd you and the people around you through that very difficult moment.
What a thing. Well, November 7th, 14th, and 21st, 7 o'clock in the evening. What a rare chance to start to explore Community Death Care Row through your generosity and auspices and all who you've learned from and tended to, and how that's come to your capacity to be in the presence of mystery, and also your knowing some stuff from having some real time in. We're really lucky to have you here at Rowe. I guess my last question for you, and I mean it in the most open way. I know you've been to Rowe. Um, what made it seem beyond that this was a good opportunity? What was it that happened at Rowe physically, or let's just say energetically? I wave my hands like energetically. That made it seem like Rowe might be a good place to be able to receive what you've come to wonder about and know.
Mm. Well, I'm so delighted to have been asked, because Rowe for me is certainly a place of human making, um,
At
a
its
place of
best, yeah.
cultural work. What's that?
At its best, for sure.
Yeah. So it seems a fitting place where there is that understanding that culture work is of great value and importance. Um, and Rowe seems to me a place too that appreciates beauty, appreciates the smaller, slower aspects of life, and that those are worthy things to put our hands to. And I love the reach that Rowe has. They've been around. It's been there for so many years,
A
and
century,
a
100
century.
years.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So um, I really appreciate the people that we might reach. I actually taught this workshop recently in person, and I was very moved to find out that many of the participants drove for hours to get to this workshop. And it was only for an afternoon. But there's such a deep appetite, such a desire to have this skill, this knowing
Yeah.
once again.
Yeah. And you don't have to drive for this course, and you get 3 whole evenings with you.
Exactly. Yes, we don't have to rush. We'll get to spend some time together, more time for conversation and questions, and hopefully spread out over the 3 weeks. You'll have time for practice.
All willing. Well, Kelly Butler, the Art of Shrouding, coming up soon from Rowe. Um, Rowe Camp and Conference Center is a nonprofit that lives by your taking programs and your donations. So we're always happy to see you and have you poke around rowecenter.org. Until next time, this is Matthew Stillman signing off for Radio Rowe. Bye.